Lady Prescott did not ask Eleanor to pour the tea. She instructed her, in the voice she used for servants who forgot their place, loud enough that every guest understood the lesson delivered along with the china. "Miss Colston will take hers first," she said, "and mind the good carpet this time." The Duke of Ashbourne sat near the tall window with the rain running silver down the glass behind him, and though he said nothing, Eleanor felt his attention settle on her hands the moment she lifted the heavy silver pot, and understood exactly whose comfort this small performance had been arranged to serve. Verity Colston arranged her skirts and watched the ritual with the particular pleasure of a woman being shown, in front of witnesses, precisely how far beneath her someone else had fallen. She was to be the next Duchess of Ashbourne, everyone understood, and a companion who poured correctly and curtsied low was a detail a future Duchess liked confirmed before the wedding. Eleanor's hands did not shake. 3 years under her aunt's roof had taught her that steadiness was the one dignity no one could take from her, and she filled the cup exactly as she had been taught, to a finger's width below the rim. She lifted the filled cup and turned to carry it to Miss Colston, and it was in that half-second, the china balanced and the whole room watching, that the Duke rose from his chair by the window without a word to anyone and crossed the carpet in 4 unhurried strides. He did not wait for the cup to reach its intended hands. He reached out and took it directly from Eleanor's, his fingers closing briefly over hers on the saucer, and the drawing room went so quiet that the rain against the glass sounded, suddenly, like the only sound left in the county. He did not explain himself. He only said, to the room in general and to no one in particular, that he found he preferred to be served by whoever poured most honestly, and drank from the cup as though he had done nothing at all unusual, while Lady Prescott's smile froze in place, and Verity Colston's gloved hands went still in her lap. Eleanor stood with the empty tray, her heart beating somewhere near her throat, understanding that something had shifted in that room that could not be poured back into its pot, though she did not yet understand what it would cost either of them to find out. Before Bramwell Hall, before the mended hems and the careful curtsies, there had been a small stone house at the edge of Fenwick Village, where Dr. Edmund Winslow kept his surgery in the front room and his daughter close beside him, teaching her the names of tinctures the way other fathers taught daughters to embroider. Eleanor had grown up measuring willow bark and feverfew into paper twists for farmers who could not pay in coin and paid instead in eggs and gratitude, and she had believed, in the unthinking way of a happy child, that her father's steady hands and steadier kindness made their small household safe from anything the world could threaten. He died 3 winters ago of the same putrid fever he had spent a fortnight fighting on behalf of half the village, worn past the point where his own body could recover what he had spent on strangers, and Eleanor had held his hand through the last of it in the room where he had once shown her how to read a pulse. The smell of drying lavender always hung from the surgery beams, and the particular scratch of her father's voice correcting her measurements stayed with her longer than almost any other sound from that house. What Dr. Winslow left behind, once the surgery was settled and the accounts examined by men who had never once needed his charity, amounted to a modest stone house mortgaged twice over and a ledger crowded with debts he had forgiven so quietly that even Eleanor had not known their full number until strangers came to collect what remained. The house was sold within the month to pay what could be paid. His instruments went to a physician in the next county who offered a fair price and did not ask why the daughter's hands trembled handing them over, and his books went with the instruments. All but a single case of glass vials Eleanor hid inside her trunk before anyone could think to value it. She arrived at Bramwell Hall in a hired chaise with that trunk and little else, to be received by her mother's elder sister, Lady Prescott, with the particular chill reserved for a debt one is obliged, but unwilling, to pay. She remembered afterward how carefully the physician in the next county wrapped each instrument in cloth before setting it into his own case, as though even a stranger understood that these were not merely tools but the accumulated years of a man's whole, patient, careful life. Lady Prescott's chill had a history longer than Eleanor's arrival. Years before, her younger sister, Eleanor's mother, had refused a prudent match arranged by their own father and married a country physician instead, for love, for a man with clean hands and no fortune, and had been quietly written out of polite conversation in the family ever since. Eleanor had inherited that old grievance along with her mother's gray eyes, and Lady Prescott, widowed now and watching her own finances thin faster than she would admit aloud, seemed to regard her niece as a standing reminder of every choice she herself had been too sensible to make. Eleanor was given a small room above the servants' stair, gowns cut down from ones no longer wanted, and a place in the household that belonged to neither family nor staff, near enough to both to be useful, distant enough from either to be forgotten the moment she was not needed. No one offered to carry her trunk up the stairs herself, and Eleanor did not ask, having already learned, in the space of a single carriage ride, precisely which small kindnesses this house extended freely, and which ones it expected a person to earn. She kept one thing that was entirely her own, wrapped in flannel at the bottom of her trunk, a small, cobalt glass vial etched with a single W, refilled from her father's own receipt whenever the apothecary in the village would sell her the willow bark, and she used it in secret to dose the housemaids through their headaches and the stable boy through his winter cough. Small kindnesses that cost her aunt nothing and earned Eleanor a loyalty below stairs that the drawing room upstairs never troubled to notice. It was the only place left in the world where she was still, briefly, her father's daughter rather than her aunt's obligation. She was measuring a dose into a cup for the scullery maid, on an ordinary gray morning in early spring, when the sound of wheels on the gravel drew her to the window, and she watched a fine carriage she did not recognize turn up toward the house, and her aunt, from the hall below, call up the stairs in a voice bright with a purpose Eleanor had not heard from her in 3 years. The stable boy's cough had eased within a week on her father's own recipe, though no one above the servant's stair had ever thought to ask how. The Colstons had made their fortune in Manchester cotton and were, by Lady Prescott's careful accounting, precisely rich enough to overlook a want of ancient lineage if a duke's mother were not alive to object to it, which, conveniently, she was not. Verity Colston arrived at Bramwell Hall in a carriage that cost more than the house's roof repairs. Fair-haired and handsomely dressed in a shade of green, Eleanor had never seen outside a fashion plate, and greeted Lady Prescott with the easy warmth of a woman who had been told, correctly, that she was about to be made very welcome indeed. She looked Eleanor over exactly once, in the hallway, the way a buyer looks over a piece of furniture included in a house sale, decided there was nothing there worth a second glance, and asked, pleasantly, whether the poor relation could be trusted to manage the tea things without incident. Lady Prescott, watching the exchange from the hallway with evident satisfaction, made no attempt to correct the slight, and Eleanor, gathering the discarded traveling cloak from where it had been dropped for her to collect, understood that her aunt considered the insult itself a useful piece of the afternoon's careful arithmetic. 3 miles distant, across a boundary hedge and a stretch of parkland, Gabriel Hartwell, Duke of Ashbourne, ran his household the way he ran everything since his father's death, and his mother's death had left him, at 19, with a title, an estate, and a sister still in the nursery to raise more or less alone. The county called him cold, and he had stopped correcting them, because coldness kept people at a distance he found easier to manage than sympathy, and sympathy was a thing he had learned, early and thoroughly, not to trust from people who wanted something. Only with Sophia, now 9 and fierce and fair-haired like their mother, did the ice in him seem to thin, and only Mrs. Firth, who had nursed them both as infants, and Hollis, his steward, saw with any regularity the man underneath the reputation. Visitors who called at Ashbourne left with the impression of a household run by ledgers and clocks rather than affection, never guessing at the quiet hour each evening when Gabriel sat at his sister's bedside reading aloud from whatever book she had chosen, a ritual he had kept without fail since their mother's death, and intended to keep without fail for as long as she needed it. It was Sophia who brought Eleanor and the Duke together the first time, months before any tea was poured. She had slipped past her governess to chase a spaniel through the hedge dividing Ashbourne's Park from Bramwell's Lane, and put her hand into a wasp's nest hidden in the brambles for her trouble, and it was Eleanor, walking that lane with a basket of gathered comfrey, who heard the child's cry and reached her first. She drew out the stings with a steady, unhurried competence, talking Sophia calmly through each one, and had a poultice of crushed leaves bound over the swelling before the Duke, running from the house at the sound of his sister's scream, arrived to find a stranger in a plain gray gown, kneeling in the mud with his sister's hand held gently in both of hers. She did not know, kneeling there in the mud with the child's small hand cradled in both of hers, that the man now running toward them was the very Duke whose coldness half the county liked to gossip about, and would not have changed a single motion of her careful work if she had known it. He did not thank her at once. He knelt beside them both, checked the dressing with the wary thoroughness of a man who trusted no one's competence until he had verified it himself, and only when he saw how correctly it had been done did he look up and ask her name, in a voice with none of the coldness the county complained of. she told him. He said it belonged to Lady Prescott's household, and she confirmed it, bracing for the small shift in his manner that usually followed that admission. But it did not come. He only said that Bramwell Hall was fortunate in her, and meant it plainly enough that she believed him. Sophia, delighted, begged to see her again, and within the week, a note in a child's careful hand had reached Bramwell Hall, which Lady Prescott read over Eleanor's shoulder with a stillness that boded nothing good at all. It was a small exchange, over almost before it began, but Eleanor carried it home that afternoon the way she carried her father's vial, folded carefully somewhere she could return to it later, and did not mention it to her aunt at all. For a few weeks after the wasp stings, the boundary lane became a kind of neutral country between two households that otherwise had no reason to meet. The Duke walked there most afternoons with Sophia, and, more often than either of them remarked upon, found Eleanor there too, gathering what the season offered, and their exchanges stayed brief and correct, and entirely within the bounds of what two near strangers might say to each other about weather and children and the stubbornness of ivy. And yet Eleanor found herself dressing more carefully for a walk to gather comfrey than she had ever dressed for one of her aunt's dinners. Lady Prescott noticed the lightness in her niece's step before she understood its cause, and once she understood it, she began finding reasons Eleanor could not be spared from the house of an afternoon: mending, accounts, the linen inventory, anything that kept her indoors and out of a lane she had never before cared who walked. Neither of them named what the lane had become, and neither of them stopped walking it, and there was a particular comfort in a friendship that required no explanation to survive, at least for as long as no one else troubled to notice it either. When the Colstons' visit was fixed for the following week, and word came separately that the Duke of Ashbourne, as the nearest gentleman of consequence, had been invited to complete the party, Lady Prescott's campaign against the lane sharpened into something more deliberate. On the morning of the visit, she called Eleanor into the small parlor alone and laid out, in a voice of perfect reasonableness, exactly what would be required of her. She would not sit with the company, she would not speak unless spoken to, and she would pour the tea herself, personally, so that any person present in any doubt about the household's true order might have it settled beyond argument. Eleanor understood, standing there in her cut-down gray gown, that this was not an instruction about tea at all, and that her aunt had chosen her audience with considerable care. Eleanor did not argue, because 3 years had taught her exactly how little arguing accomplished against a decision already made, but she found, dressing that afternoon in the plainest of her cut-down gowns, that some small, stubborn part of her refused to feel as small as the instructions intended her to feel. The drawing room, by 4 o'clock, held Verity Colston arranging herself becomingly near the fire, Lady Prescott presiding with the particular brightness of a woman certain of her plan, and the Duke seated by the window with Sophia perched beside him, quieter than the occasion strictly required. Eleanor entered with the tea tray at her aunt's summons, and felt every eye in the room measure the distance between where she stood and where she was permitted to sit. "Miss Colston will take hers first," her aunt said, in the voice reserved for servants who had forgotten themselves, "and mind you do not spill on the good carpet." And Eleanor, lifting the heavy silver pot, understood that the words were aimed considerably higher than her hands, toward a man by the window who had not yet said a single thing. Sophia, seated beside her brother, watched the whole small ceremony with the frank curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to disguise what she noticed, and it was her steady gaze, more than anyone else's in that room, that Eleanor found hardest to bear without flinching. She poured with the steadiness 3 years of practice had given her, filled the cup to the width of a finger below the rim exactly as she had been taught, and turned to carry it the short distance to Verity Colston's outstretched hand, and it was in that half-second that the Duke rose from his chair without a word to anyone and crossed the carpet in 4 unhurried strides. He did not wait for the cup to reach its intended destination. He reached out and took it directly from Eleanor's hands, his fingers closing briefly over hers on the saucer in a way that, in the strict and unspoken grammar of that drawing room, meant considerably more than manners, because a gentleman did not touch a servant's hands, and he did not intercept a cup already promised to another woman, unless he meant the whole room to understand exactly what he was claiming. It lasted no more than a second or two, that small collision of fingers and porcelain, but Eleanor would replay it for weeks afterward, unable to decide whether it had been an act of kindness, of defiance, or of something considerably more dangerous than either. The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick enough that the rain against the tall windows sounded for a moment like the only honest thing left in the room. Verity Colston's smile did not waver, though her gloved hands went very still in her lap, and Lady Prescott's face performed a swift, practiced recovery into hostess brightness that fooled no one who had watched its first true expression. The Duke said only that he preferred to be served by whoever poured most honestly, drank from the cup as though nothing at all unusual had occurred, and when he took his leave an hour later he paused at the door long enough to tell Eleanor, quietly, that he hoped the lane might see them both again soon, before Lady Prescott's smile could reassert itself. The moment the front door closed behind the last carriage, that smile vanished entirely, and Lady Prescott turned to her niece with an expression Eleanor had never yet seen her wear. Sophia, gathering her gloves to leave, paused long enough to press Eleanor's hand once, warmly, before her governess ushered her out, a small private echo of the larger gesture no one else in the room had thought to make. Lady Prescott did not raise her voice, which Eleanor had learned over 3 years to find more frightening than shouting would have been. She wanted to know, with terrible calm, what precisely Eleanor had done to draw a duke's attention across a drawing room in front of the very family whose good opinion this household could not afford to lose, and did not wait for an answer she had already decided upon. She spoke of ingratitude, of a niece who had been fed and clothed on charity, repaying it by jeopardizing the one match that might steady the family's fortunes, and she mentioned, almost in passing, that there were positions to be had in the north, with a distant cousin who kept a schoolroom, for girls who forgot the difference between kindness shown to them and encouragement invited by them. Eleanor said only that she had not asked the Duke to cross the room, and found, to her own surprise, that she was not sorry he had. She did not say aloud that she had thought of little else since the carriage door closed behind the last of their guests, because some admissions, she had learned, were safer kept exactly where her father had once kept his patients' worst diagnoses, unspoken, and carried alone. At Ashbourne that same evening, Gabriel sat too long over a cold cup of tea he had not asked to have taken from anyone's hands, turning a name over in his mind that had first unsettled him weeks earlier in a muddy lane, and had not stopped unsettling him since. Mrs. Firth found him there past the hour he usually retired, and asked, in the plain voice she had used since he was in short coats, what precisely was troubling him enough to let good tea go cold. He asked her, instead of answering, whether she remembered a Dr. Winslow, from Fenwick, years back, and watched the old woman's face still in a way that told him everything, before she said a single word aloud. He had spent 6 years training himself not to ask certain questions, not of Mrs. Firth, not of the county, not of the quiet portrait gallery he avoided walking past after dark, and yet here he was, past midnight, asking the one question he had spent 6 years avoiding most carefully of all, because a stranger's steady hands in a muddy lane had made the avoiding, suddenly, impossible to sustain. Mrs. Firth set down her mending and told him, carefully, what she knew he had been too young and too frightened at the time to hold on to clearly, that when the old Duchess had sickened with the putrid fever the winter Sophia was born, it had been Dr. Winslow from the village who came first and diagnosed it correctly and proposed a course of treatment gentle enough to give her a fighting chance, and it had been the London physician his grandmother trusted who overruled a country doctor's advice in favor of bleeding her, and the Duchess had not survived the week that followed. Winslow had been dismissed without payment and without a word of defense from a family too grieved and too proud to admit a village doctor might have been right where their own man of fashion had been wrong, and Gabriel, 19 and newly a duke, and utterly unable to countermand his own grandmother, had let it happen, and had carried the shape of that failure quietly ever since. Gabriel listened without interrupting, his hands very still on the arms of his chair, and did not trust himself to speak again until Mrs. Firth had gathered her mending and left him alone with the fire, and 6 years of a silence he finally understood the shape of. He did not sleep well that night, and he slept worse 3 days later when word reached Ashbourne that Sophia had taken a chill after standing too long in the rain watching for a spaniel that had run off toward the hedge, a chill that by morning had settled into her chest with a heat under the skin that Mrs. Firth, feeling the child's forehead, did not like the look of at all. The household physician, sent for at first light, pronounced it nothing a few days' rest would not cure, and departed for another appointment before noon. But Gabriel stood in the nursery doorway, watching his sister's cheeks flush an unfamiliar red, and heard, underneath his own reasonable calm, an old and terrible word he had not let himself think in 6 years. He thought, standing there, of the last time he had watched a fever take hold in this house, of physicians who arrived too late, or trusted the wrong remedy, and found himself, absurdly, wishing for a particular pair of steady hands he had only met once, in a muddy lane months before. By the second night, the fever had climbed past anything the household physician's tinctures had touched, and Sophia, half in delirium, kept asking in a small cracked voice for the lady from the lane who had known just what to do about the wasps, until Mrs. Firth, wringing a cloth in the basin, finally said aloud what everyone in the room had been too correct to suggest, that Miss Winslow, whatever her situation, had clearly been raised by a man who knew fevers, and that pride was a poor substitute for a cure. Gabriel stood at the window with his jaw set hard enough to ache, weighing 3 years of his own guarded rules against his sister's cracked voice repeating a stranger's name, and it did not take him long to decide which mattered less. He told Hollis to take the fastest horse to Bramwell Hall and not to return without her. He did not stop to consider what the county would say of sending a groom in the dead of night to fetch an unmarried woman to his sister's sickbed, because for the first time in 6 years a single fear had grown large enough to make every other consideration feel entirely beside the point. Eleanor came, in her cloak still damp from the ride, without stopping to explain herself to a startled Lady Prescott left standing in her own hallway, and went straight to the nursery, where she knelt by the small bed and studied the flush along Sophia's collarbone with a stillness Gabriel recognized, distantly, from a muddy lane months before. She asked for warm water, for the window opened a hand's width despite the household physician's instructions to the contrary, and she drew from her cloak pocket a small cobalt glass vial etched with a single letter, measuring drops of it into a cup with the exact unhurried care of someone who had done this 100 times before and trusted every measurement. "This is not the same fever that frightens everyone in this county," she said quietly, to Gabriel rather than to the room, "but it wants watching carefully through the night, not bleeding. Whatever the London man tells you tomorrow." Gabriel did not question the instruction, though it ran contrary to everything the household physician had prescribed that morning, because something in the calm certainty of her voice reminded him, powerfully and painfully, of the one other person in his life who had ever spoken about fevers with that exact unhurried authority. She stayed through the worst of it, sponging Sophia's wrists and throat when the heat climbed, coaxing sips of her father's tincture between the child's cracked lips at intervals she counted by a small watch pinned at her waist, and refusing every offer of rest herself with a firmness that left no room for argument. Gabriel sat across the narrow bed for most of those hours, not speaking, watching her hands work with a competence that unknotted something in his chest even as it frightened him, because he had watched hands work exactly this steadily once before, in this same house, on a bed not so very far from this one, and had watched them fail against a fever no gentleness could out-argue. Toward the gray edge of dawn, Sophia's breathing eased, her color settling from that terrible flush into something merely tired, and Eleanor sat back on her heels at last and let out a breath she had been holding, by his count, for nearly 6 hours. He would remember, long afterward, that he had not once thought of rank or reputation or the county's opinion through any of those hours, only of the steadiness of her hands moving in the candlelight and the small, ragged sound of his sister finally breathing easily again. He found the vial later that morning, left on the nursery washstand where Eleanor had set it down to sleep for an hour in the chair Mrs. Firth had finally forced her into, and he turned it over in the early light and read the single etched letter on the glass the way a man reads something he has been half dreading and half hoping to find for weeks. He had seen a case of vials very like it once, years ago, carried by a village physician his grandmother had dismissed from this very house without so much as a fair hearing, and he understood, standing alone in the gray nursery with his sister finally sleeping soundly and a stranger's father's initials cool against his palm, that the debt his family owed was considerably older and very much larger than the one he had imagined settling by taking a teacup from her hands. He did not wake her to ask his questions. He set the vial down exactly where he had found it, careful not to disturb the single detail that had already told him everything he needed to know, and stood watching the two of them sleep, sister and stranger, in the fragile gray hush of a debt he had only just begun to understand how to repay. Gabriel informed Lady Prescott, in a note carried by Hollis that made no request and offered no apology, that Miss Winslow would remain at Ashbourne under Mrs. Firth's chaperonage until Sophia's recovery was beyond doubt, and that he considered the arrangement a matter settled rather than a matter for discussion. Lady Prescott's reply, when it came, was all graciousness on the surface and fury beneath it, but she was not fool enough to argue publicly against a duke's concern for a sick child, and so Eleanor stayed, given a small guest room down the corridor from the nursery, and a freedom of the house she had not known anywhere in 3 years, and found herself, for the first time since her father's death, treated as a person whose judgment was trusted rather than merely tolerated. She wrote to no one about it, not even to explain her absence to the few acquaintances who might have wondered, because she had learned that some kindnesses were easiest to keep if she did not examine them too closely for how long they were likely to last, or what her aunt would demand of her once they inevitably ended. On the third evening, with Sophia sleeping soundly and no longer needing a constant hand at her brow, Gabriel found Eleanor in the library selecting a book to read by the fire, and instead of retreating, as he had trained himself to do with most people who wandered into his rooms uninvited, he asked her, with a carefulness that surprised them both, to tell him about her father. She talked for nearly an hour, longer than she had spoken about him to anyone since his death, of the surgery's small stone room, and the twists of paper folded around dried herbs, and the patients who paid in eggs and gratitude, and Gabriel listened with an attention so complete that she did not notice, until she had nearly finished, how carefully he was watching her face for something she had not yet said. She had not realized, until she saw his face change, how rarely anyone asked her to speak of her father as a man, rather than as a cautionary tale about debts and disgrace, and something in her chest loosened at being allowed, finally, to remember him proudly instead of carefully. When she paused, he told her, in a voice stripped of its usual composure, that he believed he had met her father once, or rather had stood in a room while her father was turned away from it, 6 years before, when the old duchess lay dying of a fever a country physician had diagnosed correctly, and a fashionable one had treated wrongly, at the family's own insistence. He told her about the bloodletting, about the dismissal without payment or defense, about a 19-year-old boy, too newly a duke, and too thoroughly overruled by his own grandmother, to say the single sentence that might have changed everything, and about 6 years of carrying that silence as though it weighed nothing, because admitting its weight would have meant admitting whose fault the silence truly was. Eleanor listened without moving, aware that whatever came next between them would be built, one way or another, on the foundation of this confession, and aware too that a lesser man would have found some gentler version of the story to offer her, instead of the whole unflattering truth of his own youth and failure. Eleanor sat very still through all of it, and felt, distinctly, two things arrive in her chest at once and refuse to resolve into a single feeling. The old grief for a father who had come home from that dismissal, quieter than she had ever seen him, who had never once spoken his former patients' names again, though the county's other great houses had followed the Ashbournes' lead in withdrawing their custom soon after, and a harder, more complicated tenderness for the boy Gabriel had been, powerless in his own house at 19, watching a decision made over his head that he had spent 6 years failing to forgive himself for. She did not tell him it did not matter, because it did, and she would not insult either of their fathers by pretending otherwise. But she did, after a long silence, ask him to say her father's full name aloud, once, properly, the way she had not heard anyone but herself say it in 3 years. She thought of her father's own gentleness, how he had never once spoken bitterly of the family that had ruined him, and understood, with some reluctance, that she wanted to be capable of that same grace herself, even now, even here, even with the debt still so plainly unpaid. He said it, Dr. Edmund Winslow. He said it slowly and correctly, the way he had once repeated her own name until he had it right, and something in Eleanor's chest that had been clenched since the day the strangers came to collect her father's debts loosened, very slightly, for the first time. She told him, quietly, that her father had believed a debt of kindness mattered more in the ledger of a life than any debt of coin, and that he would likely have forgiven the Ashbournes long before she herself managed it, because forgiving people had always come easier to him than to her. Gabriel said that he did not intend to ask forgiveness so much as to earn it, slowly, in whatever ways a man in his position was still capable of earning anything honestly, and Eleanor, watching the firelight move over a face the county called cold, found she believed every careful word of it. Sophia, listening from the doorway longer than either adult realized, would later tell Mrs. Firth that she had never seen her brother's face look quite like that before, softened all the way through, as though something heavy he had carried a very long time had finally been set down. In the week that followed, before anyone at Bramwell Hall had cause to summon her home, Eleanor learned by accident, from a comment Mrs. Firth let slip while restocking the still room, that Gabriel had written personally to the College of Physicians in London to have the record of her father's diagnosis formally reviewed and corrected, 6 years too late to matter to anyone but the dead, and the daughter left holding his name, and had done it quietly enough that he had clearly not meant her to find out and thank him for it. She found him in the stable yard that afternoon checking a mare's shoe, and said nothing about the letter directly, only that her father would have found the gesture unnecessary and entirely typical of a man too proud to leave a wrong unmended once he had noticed it. And Gabriel, not looking up from the horse's hoof, admitted that he supposed he had inherited that particular flaw from someone. She thought, watching him work the shoe free with the same careful attention he gave to every task he considered worth doing properly, that a man's true character showed itself most honestly in rooms no one important was watching, and found she trusted the stable-yard version of him rather more than the drawing-room one. On what both of them understood, without saying so, might be her last afternoon at Ashbourne before propriety required her return to Bramwell Hall, Sophia insisted on a walk to the herb garden to show Eleanor which plants had survived the winter under her own careful tending. And Gabriel came with them, ostensibly to supervise, and stood close enough at the garden wall that when Sophia ran ahead chasing the spaniel toward the hedge, the silence between the two adults left behind had a different weight to it than any silence had carried between them before. He said her name, only her name, in a voice low enough that it was almost lost beneath the wind in the hedge, and had drawn one careful step nearer when Hollis's voice carried across the lawn to announce, with the worst possible timing of his long and otherwise excellent service, that Lady Prescott's carriage had arrived to collect Miss Winslow. The moment passed, as such moments so often do, interrupted rather than resolved, but Eleanor carried the shape of it with her all the way back to Bramwell Hall, turning it over the way she once turned over her father's more difficult diagnoses. Certain something significant had nearly happened, and uncertain, still, what to call it. Bramwell Hall received her back with a chill, considerably sharper than the one she had left behind 3 weeks earlier, because Lady Prescott had spent those 3 weeks watching a plan she had thought secured slip further from her grasp, with every note that arrived from Ashbourne inquiring after Miss Winslow's comfort, and a woman who felt her own future threatened, rarely troubled to disguise the fact for long. Eleanor was given back her small room above the servants' stair, her cut-down gowns, and a schedule of chores heavier than the one she had left, as though her aunt meant to remind her, hour by hour, exactly how little her weeks of being treated as a person of consequence had actually changed. Word of that extended stay, meanwhile, had already begun making its way through the county's drawing rooms in the particular distorted shape gossip always chose for a story it found more entertaining than true. She said nothing of it to her aunt, because there was nothing yet to say that would not sound, spoken aloud in this cold house, smaller and more foolish than it had felt standing at that garden wall. And some things, she had learned, kept their shape better in silence. Verity Colston, informed of both the gossip and its inconvenient timing by a mother eager to salvage a match now visibly in danger, called at Bramwell Hall within the week, and the two women who had never before found much use for one another discovered, over tea, Eleanor was not summoned to pour, a shared and pressing interest in solving the same problem quickly. By the time the visit ended, Lady Prescott had a letter half composed to her distant cousin in the north, offering her niece's services in the schoolroom there, as though it were an act of generosity rather than removal, and Verity Colston had a fresh, careful plan of her own for reminding the Duke, before any letter needed sending at all, exactly which of the two women in this county was actually suited to stand beside him. Neither woman troubled to lower her voice enough to keep the plan entirely from the servants passing in the corridor, and it was through exactly that carelessness, 3 days later, that word of the scheme first reached Ashbourne, though not yet in time, and not yet through anyone brave enough to carry it directly to the Duke himself. Verity Colston found Eleanor alone in the still room 2 mornings later, and came straight to the point with the particular efficiency of a woman who had never needed more than one attempt to make herself understood. She did not raise her voice or make threats that could later be repeated to anyone's disadvantage. She spoke instead, gently, reasonably, of what a scandal attached to an unmarried companion's extended stay in a bachelor duke's house would do to a young girl already motherless and fragile, to a man already whispered about for his coldness, to a reputation neither Sophia nor Gabriel had done anything to deserve losing on Eleanor's account, and asked, as though the answer were obvious to any woman who genuinely cared for either of them, whether Eleanor truly wished to be the reason both of them suffered for it. Eleanor did not answer at once, turning the argument over the way her father had taught her to turn over an uncertain diagnosis, searching for the flaw in reasoning that sounded on its surface so entirely reasonable, and found, eventually, that she could not disprove a single word of it, only resent how neatly it served the woman speaking it. Lady Prescott delivered the practical half of the argument that same evening, laying the letter to the northern cousin on the table between them already sealed, the position already as good as accepted on Eleanor's behalf, and framed the whole arrangement as an opportunity too generous for a girl in her position to refuse without appearing willfully ungrateful for 3 years of shelter she had done nothing to earn. She did not need to say aloud what would happen if Eleanor refused. The coldness in the room said it for her, the same coldness that had once threatened a distant cousin's schoolroom as punishment and now offered it as a favor. And Eleanor understood that the difference between banishment and opportunity, in her aunt's careful language, had never been more than a matter of which words were chosen to describe the same closed door. Eleanor did not open the letter to read its terms in full. She had already decided, somewhere between the still room and this cold parlor, that the kindest thing she could do for everyone at Ashbourne was to remove herself from their lives quietly, before her presence there cost either of them anything more than it already had. She did not go to Ashbourne to say any of it aloud, because she had turned Verity Colston's words over enough times by then to half believe them herself, that whatever had grown between herself and Gabriel in a sick room and a stable yard and a herb garden could not survive being carried out into a county that had already decided what story it preferred to tell about the two of them. She wrote instead, sitting at the small writing desk in her room past midnight, a letter that took her 4 attempts to keep short and dignified rather than honest and pleading, thanking him for his family's kindness to hers and wishing Sophia continued health, and said nothing at all about the reason she was leaving, because saying it would have meant asking him to choose between his sister's reputation and a promise neither of them had yet had the chance to make. She read it over twice before sealing it, satisfied that it revealed nothing a careful reader could use against either of them, and told herself, without entirely believing it, that a clean departure now was a kindness, however much it felt, folding the paper closed, like the opposite of one. The carriage was ordered for first light, before the household properly woke, at Lady Prescott's insistence that early travel suited the roads better, though Eleanor understood well enough it suited a quiet departure better too. She left the letter with a maid to be carried to Ashbourne once she was safely on the road, packed her father's cobalt vial wrapped in flannel at the very top of her trunk where her hand could find it without looking, and climbed into the carriage in the gray half-light with a composure she had learned, over 3 hard years, to wear like armor even when it fit her badly. The wheels had not yet cleared the drive when she allowed herself, finally, one unwatched moment to press her gloved hand hard against her mouth and did not look back at the house, because looking back had never once changed anything it was already too late to change. She did not weep for long. There was a particular discipline in grief managed quietly, in a moving carriage, with no one to witness it but the gray fields sliding past the window, and she had, by now, considerable practice in exactly that kind of discipline. The letter reached Ashbourne 2 hours after Eleanor's carriage had already cleared the county line, and Gabriel read it twice before he understood that its careful, grateful sentences were built entirely around the shape of everything it did not say. Sophia, told only that Eleanor had gone home, cried until Mrs. Firth could no longer pretend the household was simply managing a departure rather than surviving one, and it was Mrs. Firth, holding the sobbing child, who finally told Gabriel what a housemaid had overheard 3 days before in the still-room doorway, of Miss Colston's gentle, reasonable, devastating little speech about scandal and reputations, and what a woman who truly cared for someone ought to be willing to sacrifice for them. He read the letter a 3rd time, searching its careful sentences for some instruction he could follow, some door left deliberately ajar, and found none, because Eleanor had written it precisely to leave him nothing to follow, believing, wrongly, that leaving him nothing was the kindest gift she had left to give. He was on horseback within 10 minutes, having wasted none of them on his own coat or his own dignity, and rode the 3 miles to Bramwell Hall hard enough that Hollis, following on a 2nd horse, could not keep pace with him. He learned from a startled footman that Miss Winslow's carriage had left before dawn bound for the North Road, and turned his own horse without dismounting toward the village, where the mail coach and every private carriage on that road were obliged to stop to change horses at the Bell Inn, and where, God willing, 3 hours' head start might not yet be an hour, He could not still make up if the roads had been as poor as the week's rain promised. He did not stop to consider what the county would make of a duke racing bareheaded through the rain after his neighbor's poor relation, because for the second time in a fortnight, a single fear had grown large enough to make every other consideration feel entirely beside the point. And this time, there was no fever to blame for the urgency, only the plain, unbearable thought of arriving too late. He found her carriage standing in the inn yard, horses half changed, and found Eleanor herself standing very still beside it in the cold morning light, having just that moment turned to find Lady Prescott and Verity Colston arrived from Bramwell Hall to see the departure properly finished, as though a scandal required witnesses to be considered truly settled. Gabriel crossed the yard the way he had once crossed a drawing room, in strides that left no doubt of his intention, and did not stop at a polite distance from any of the three women. He said, to the whole yard, loudly enough that the ostlers paused with the horses' bridles still in hand, that the last time he had taken something from Miss Winslow's hands in front of a room full of witnesses, he had meant it as a claim on her, plainly, though he had not yet finished saying so aloud, and he did not intend to leave this yard, or let her carriage leave it, until he had. The inn yard had gone very quiet by then, ostlers and travelers alike sensing, with the instinct of people who spent their lives watching other people's departures, that they were witnessing something considerably more important than a change of horses. Verity Colston's composure did not survive the sentence intact, and Lady Prescott's face went through a rapid succession of expressions that settled, finally, on something close to genuine fear for what her own scheming had nearly cost her family's standing with a duke who now looked entirely capable of remembering every unkindness in detail for the rest of his life. Eleanor stood by the carriage door with her gloved hand still on its frame, too stunned by the sight of him, breathless and travel-dusted in the inn yard, to manage more than his name, and Gabriel closed the last few feet between them, took her hand away from the carriage the way he had once taken a teacup from it, and told her, quietly now, meant for her alone though half the yard could still hear it, that he had not ridden 3 miles to watch her leave. It was, in its way, the same gesture he had made in her aunt's drawing room weeks before, a claim made in front of witnesses rather than whispered in private, except this time he did not stop at taking something from her hands. He kept it. They walked away from the inn yard's audience toward the low stone wall bordering the churchyard, out of easy hearing though not out of sight, and Gabriel, still holding her hand as though he had not yet decided he was permitted to, told her plainly that he did not want an apology to be the last thing that passed between his family and hers, and that he had been turning over, these past weeks, an idea he hoped she would let him finish before she answered anything else he meant to ask her. He wanted to rebuild the old dispensary at Fenwick, properly this time, with her father's name over the door and her own hands, if she wished it, to run it as she saw fit, and he wanted, if she would have him, to spend the considerably longer remainder of his life making certain no Winslow ever again stood outside a door in this county that ought to have been open to them. Eleanor listened to all of it with her hand still caught in his, watching the churchyard's old stones and the gray morning light beyond them, and thought that her father, who had believed so firmly in debts of kindness properly paid, would have approved of this one more than any other. Eleanor found she could not answer him at first for the tightness in her throat, and when she finally could, she told him that her father had always said a debt of kindness, properly paid, could outweigh even the largest wrong, and that she believed, standing here in a cold inn yard with his hand still around hers, that he had just paid his family's debt considerably beyond what honesty required of him. She said yes to the dispensary, and yes, more quietly, to the rest of it, and Gabriel, Duke of Ashbourne, laughed for the first time in longer than either of them could have named, a sound so unfamiliar to the yard's onlookers that Hollis later swore he had never once heard it in 11 years of service, and kissed her hand exactly once, gently, over the glove, before either of them remembered they still had an audience. Behind them, at a distance neither troubled to notice, Lady Prescott stood very still beside her own abandoned scheme, and Verity Colston, already calculating how quickly she might leave the county without appearing to have lost anything at all, discovered that some defeats were considerably harder to disguise than others. Sophia told the news that evening with a formality neither of them quite managed to sustain, shrieked with a joy entirely unbefitting a young lady of her supposed breeding, and declared that she had known it since the Wasps, and Mrs. Firth wept openly and without apology over a pot of tea neither Eleanor nor Gabriel had asked anyone to pour. At the wedding breakfast, months later, in a drawing room considerably warmer than the one where this had all begun, Eleanor poured the tea herself, by her own choice this time, and Gabriel crossed the room in the same 4 unhurried strides to take his cup directly from her hands, and the whole assembled company, Lady Prescott included, watched a gesture that had once meant scandal transform, in front of them, into nothing more remarkable than a husband glad of his wife's hands. Verity Colston did not attend the wedding, having found, in the intervening months, a baronet in a neighboring county rather more easily impressed than a duke who remembered every unkindness in detail, and Lady Prescott, who did attend, found she could not quite meet her niece's eyes across the crowded room, though Eleanor, generous in her new happiness, did not make her try. The old dispensary at Fenwick reopened before the first snow, with Dr. Edmund Winslow's name repainted over the door in letters Eleanor had chosen herself, and a small case of cobalt glass vials, refilled now from a stock that never wanted for willow bark or feverfew again, kept on the very shelf where her father had once kept his own. Sophia visited most afternoons to help measure doses she was not yet quite old enough to measure correctly, and Gabriel, who still could not walk past a hedge without glancing toward it, found some ordinary excuse to ride into the village nearly every day the weather allowed. Eleanor did not know yet, that autumn, how many more winters they would have together, or how many children might one day run the lane between Ashbourne and the dispensary her father would have loved to see standing again, but she had already decided, quietly, that whatever the years brought, she meant to meet every one of them exactly as her father had taught her, with steady hands and nothing left to prove. It was, she had long ago decided, the only inheritance that had ever truly mattered.